Welcome to Herbally Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
Greetings, and thank you for joining me, Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbally Yours, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. You can listen live on air or online at iHeartRadio, Odyssey, TuneIn app, smart speakers, nccradio.org, or on our own award-winning WHPC app. Download it today. And on any other of your usual podcast locations. Herbally Yours has consistently brought you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living since 1990. And today we are so happy to have on board as our guest Jen Frey. Jen Frey is going to be talking about communicating with plants, heart-based practices for connecting with plant spirits. And some of you may have attended my plant workshops. We have them all over, and one is at Restoration Farm right there in Old Bethpage, where we actually go out and practice both communicating with plants and gathering plants to make them into herbal medicine locally here on Long Island, and we have lots of classes online as well. Jen Frey is a healer, mentor, and earth advocate with more than 20 years of experience with plant essences, energy work, and herbal practices. And she is the founder of Brigid's Way and co-steward of Heart Springs Sanctuary. She has dedicated her life to the spiritual path of plant work, and she lives in Pennsylvania. You can find her at brigidsway.com. And thank you so much for joining us today, Jen.
Thank you, Ellen. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Let's go back in time. And I see you studied with Pan Montgomery, who's one of my contemporaries, because I've been doing this since 1960. But what led you to become interested in being a plant person?
Well, I always say I don't feel like I had much of a choice. Mm-hmm. I was actually thinking about this morning, that one of my earliest memories was wanting to be a healer, and I didn't know. And so we're talking like age 2, because I know some other memories from back then. And but then I wasn't quite sure about that path. It kind of wound back and forth. But both of my grandparents, both sides of my grandparents, were really, plants were very important to them. On my father's side, those grandparents grew most of their own food. They had about a half acre of land in the suburbs. And so they had fruit trees and nut trees and a huge vegetable garden. And, taught me that the best medicine came from the garden. And then my maternal grandfather, who's probably actually my biggest influence, he went to school to be a chicken farmer, which it still blows my mind that people went to college to be chicken farmers. And, learned, like many, that he couldn't really support his family in that way. And so then he he became a Methodist minister. And I think he did that because most of his life he could then spend in the garden. That was his real passion. And so from an early age, he taught me about asking permission from the plants. And we had to sing to the strawberries. There was always music playing in his greenhouse. And so they both just introduced me to the magic of plants, that there was never a time that they weren't important in my life.
So you really had an early and familial kind of introduction.
I did. Of course, my studies continued to grow. Like, neither of them was really interested in herbs. I mean, my maternal grandfather took a lot of supplements, but didn't really go to an herbal doctor per se. But then, like in 6th grade, I had this chronic bronchitis that I would get every year, and I discovered about thyme and healing for bronchitis. And so I decided to try it, and it worked. And that is what really got me on to studying herbs. And then junior high and was flower essences and homeopathy. So, it just spun out from there.
Well, let's remind our listeners that besides being an expert in plants and plant communication, you have a new book, and that is called Communicating with Plants, Heart-Based Practices for Connecting with Plant Spirits. Is that the name of the book?
Yep, that's it.
So if people just search Communicating with Plants, Jen Frey, they should be able to come right up on a place that they could get that book.
Absolutely.
What made you decide, because you obviously have a lot of knowledge about plants and about herbal medicine, to focus a lot of work, because writing books are hard, I've written many of them, it's a lot of time, with this particular topic, communicating with plants?
So it wasn't my choice, really. So, back when, in somewhere around 2006 is when I started to realize that I was consciously communicating with plants from a young age. That had been a desire of mine, and I always had hoped that I would be good enough. That's what I thought, like we had to be a special person to be able to communicate with plants. And then around 2006, I was working with mulberry, and I started realizing that all these solutions that were coming to really difficult problems I was facing with were coming to me from the mulberry trees. And so I started delving more into consciously communicating with plants. And from then on, I wanted to share it with anybody and everybody, because it was just saying, like, we're all able to do this. Like, we don't have to be special. There's nothing wrong with you. This is what you're meant to do. And way back then, they had asked me to write a book. But I said, I was in my late 20s, and I'm like, what do I know about writing a book? There are so many wiser people out there who've had much more life experience with plants, that they're the ones that should be writing the book. So I thought I was being really humble. And then as time went on, I realized that I was not being humble. I was being arrogant, because I was thinking it was coming from me. And the plants were adamant that they wanted to write the book. I was just the pencil. And so we started on this book. It's been a really long process, like over 10 years of, starting, stopping. And I had a whole other book plan created, and it just wasn't happening. And I was adamant I didn't want to write a book about plant communication. And then the plants just made it very clear that's what they want. And as soon as I gave in and started writing it, it just everything lined up. The book contract came in no time at all, as soon as, like, within days of me submitting it, and everything started flowing. So it was really the plants' push, not mine.
Well, it's definitely a beautiful thing. And I would say almost everyone who has plants has experienced communicating with plants. They may not be aware of it, especially, let's say you live in a house. And every day you walk past a certain plant. These plants are individual entities who absolutely are releasing fields that can be measured. And that is even how they made the polygraph machine, measuring
Right.
our own fields. And then also in a wonderful book called The Secret Life of Plants, it delves deeply into measuring that same kind of electromagnetic field from plants.
Yeah, that's actually a really special book to me, because my maternal grandfather, he bought that book in 1973 when it came out. And my grandfather unfortunately had dementia. And it was a long process with him for many years. So he gave me all of his books, all of his plant and gardening books. But I didn't read that one until much later. And by the time I read it, he was too far gone. I couldn't have a conversation with him. But after I read, I'm like, oh, I think my grandfather was consciously communicating with plants, and he didn't have anybody to talk to about it. So he never used those words. But it is something, again, that book was probably one of the first in the English language to talk about plant intelligence. And we've had so many since then. But this is what Indigenous people have known all along, that plants communicate with us. They're our relatives. They want to be in relationship with us. They want to connect with us. And it's our birthright. We all have the ability to talk to them, and our lives depend on being able to communicate with them.
That's true. So it's just a matter of becoming aware of that. But your book does a beautiful job, and the scientists, if people do want to look up The Secret Life of Plants, it's actually available also on YouTube, the full movie. I did know that person that is in that movie. His name is Cleve Baxter, and he is the person who studied those electromagnetic waves and actually brought forth the polygraph machine in terms of its use as a lie detector. So I've been involved in this also for so long, and I love that you're sharing your perspective of you yourself getting something that might be interpreted as spiritual messages, but actually the more we know, the more we understand that they're not only in the realm of spirit. These are actual measurable electromagnetic fields that hit your consciousness and then can be interpreted.
Right, absolutely.
So what is your best suggestion to help someone who feels like, well, maybe they are communicating with their plants?
So, the biggest thing is time, so it's just we have to spend time sitting with the plant, and ideally it's the same plant. So in my book, we have different activities, and I have 17 of them. And when I teach my classes, we don't quite have that amount of them, but we still go out and sit with the plant many times for hours at a time. And the reason for that is just like the same as with a human, right? You only get to know so much about a person the first time you sit with them, and the more you sit with them, the more you uncover, the more that comes out. But also in that process, you start to discover how you receive information. So in the beginning, like the number one thing is, yes, time, spend time with a plant. And then the other is that we want to get into our heart space. So again, you seem to like science, so I'll just say there's a lot of science backing this up, that our hearts are the the primary perceptive organ of our body. And so when we get into our heart intelligence, we become more receptive and more creative, and it's much easier to connect with other beings, plants, people, animals. And so therefore, communication can flow more freely. And it's also more accurate because we're mostly overriding our filters that tell us, this isn't possible, or I'm just making this up. And on that end, I also always encourage people to be willing to make it up. There's so much of us we're so afraid that we're just creating this, or we might go insane. People might, lock us away or whatever. But I think what we're doing, again, having those multiple times there, is we're looking for patterns. And so you start to see certain messages are coming again and again. And then, of course, we can compare notes with other people, and they might have something similar. They don't always, because the plants also give us what we personally need. But it is helpful sometimes to have another set of eyes look and say, like, oh, yeah, that absolutely makes sense. That's one of the things I do in my classes is I sit there and I listen to people, their experiences, and then I help them to understand them.
Well,
go ahead.
It's quite a beautiful book. I just want to remind our listeners that you are listening to Herbally Yours right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. You can always listen live on air in your car or on your little radio in your kitchen. Does anyone still have that? Well, we did that. But now you can also get us online at nccradio.org or iHeartRadio or any of your podcast listening venues. And today we have as our guest Jen Frey. That's Jen, and Frey, Jen Frey. And we're talking about her new book, Communicating with Plants. And you can find it with that name. It's Heart-Based Practices for Connecting with Plant Spirits. And I think that's a beautiful name, really. And thank you for mentioning that when people are going to sit with a plant to try this, because you brought this up several times, plants are individuals. That tree growing in front of someone's house has been there probably much, much longer than that person has in that house. So it actually has a consciousness and knows a lot about what's going on there. It's not just the tree. And the same is true even with lower plants such as flowers and grasses. Those are individuals.
Yeah, they're both individuals and communal, which is hard for us to recognize, but the same is true for us. And so I say that because, when you're tapping into that tree, you're getting the tree's message and the tree's wisdom. but they also can let you know what's going on in the ecosystem around there. And again, science is showing us that we can't just remove one being from an ecosystem and everything is okay, because it's all connected. So that's a really wonderful thing that plants are teaching us, is that we're individuals, but we're also connected to everything, and all of it affects us, whether we're aware of it or not.
That is a really good message. So I know that you have a lot going on in terms of information that you share, your website, and you have YouTube and Facebook and Instagram. By the way, we will have all those links listed on our archive. So if people hear this show on the radio, or now I found out you can just look at the face of your phone and there's something that you press it's called podcasts, and you can actually get Herbally Yours from WHPC on anybody's little podcast link there, as well as our other show, The Natural Nurse and Dr. Z. So people might be listening to this all different ways. But what is the easiest way to find you? Like perhaps just Google your name. Would that bring you to all those things, Jen Frey?
I would say actually my website, which is brigidsway.com. And I spell it the Irish way, which is BRIGIDSWAY.
And from there, they can visit all those other venues.
Yeah, and it has my email there too. So, people can send me lovely little notes. I love to hear from people. And ask questions.
So if someone did, decide to attempt this, usually those kind of people who do attempt this don't feel like they're going to be arrested and sent to the nut house. They know they've been getting those messages already. And even just from hearing our show today, it will validate the fact that not only is it a very, very common experience amongst almost all humans, whether or not they've paid attention to it, it's also very specifically scientifically validated. As a matter of fact, in every cell, we have receptors, specific and different receptors, where things can fit in, and those are called receptor sites. And there are receptor sites specifically for intra-species communication. That means like you and I talking to each other, or other humans speaking to each other. And there are also other distinct receptor sites for interspecies communication, which means communication between species. And if that hasn't happened to you with plants, it probably has if you've ever had a pet. Almost every pet owner feels like their pet is communicating to them, like, let's go for a walk, or I'm hungry, or I'm happy, or, they seem to be more able to really tune into that. Those are the same receptor sites that are stimulated with communicating with any being. And that could be rocks also, by the way, who have a very strong electromagnetic field as well as a piezoelectric field. So whether you're into the realm of spirituality or science, plant communication is very validated.
Yeah, yes, and I agree. I love that you point out rocks because often people will talk about it's easiest to communicate with living beings, and then we don't think rocks are living, but they are absolutely living. And yes, their intelligence is so different. So while my book focuses on plants, I actually communicate with all of nature, and it's so interesting, the different messages that you receive and in the different ways.
Well, you can give us perhaps a specific example of how communicating with plants has changed your life.
Oh, I never like this question because it's so hard because there's so many examples. For me, one, communicating with plants got me to really follow my dreams and start the healing practice. Many might consider this challenging, but they convinced me to leave a very toxic, abusive marriage and helped me find the place where I'm currently living. They've helped me with different illnesses, personal illnesses, and of course they guide the way in my healing practice. So for my own clients, they help clear things that aren't of service to them. They help us show what the pattern are. I mean, there's really no limit to what the plants can teach us and show us, which is one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about sharing plant communication. Because in the past, you said you've been doing this since the 60s. And so you know that in the past, there was a lot of people who love plants. and are like interested in herbs or natural healing, that they were the ones that were really into learning how to communicate with them. But now I feel like we need everybody, because there's such a global crisis, right? There's so many change going on. And so nature has the wisdom to show us how to create this better world where we can all thrive, and all beings can be created or treated as sacred. And so we need people in different fields who aren't necessarily consider themselves plant people to learn how to communicate, to guide them. So it could be in green building, it could be in solar design, it could be in pharmaceuticals. There's just no limit.
Well, that's true. Everybody has their own unique experience. And one thing that I love to teach in terms of a technique while someone's doing, like you talked about, sitting with an individual plant, is the fact that the actual communication center, if you think about our body, so our brain is on the top and our genitals are towards the bottom. But if we think about a tree, it's actually the opposite, because where the flowers are, or the fruit, that is the sexual organ and the reproductive capacity place of plants, and those are on the top. While their main communication area, that would be like their brain, is sometimes called the wood wide web, but it's on the microbes of the fibrils of the roots. So I always like to think about a plant when I'm going to do direct communication with it in terms of sort of standing on its head, and I will project my conscious thoughts and receptors as well into the root area, and I find that you get a much clearer and faster communication route.
Yeah, that's one of the steps in the book, is what we call grounding. And it is definitely that we can communicate via the roots. And those roots, again, take us out even farther, connecting with all of nature.
Yeah, it's quite amazing to see how complex that system is. And, you know, how much, like you brought up, that it's being rapidly destroyed all over the world, which is not necessarily to humans' benefit in the end, although it might make someone a lot of money short term.
Right. It's definitely not our benefit to the end.
Right, because it's very, very disruptive. And what kind of messages do the plants share with you?
Oh my gosh, again, there's so many, but, you know, often since we're talking about the future of Earth, that's a question I often get asked by people. And the plants are always so hopeful for me. They definitely, when I mess up, they definitely let me know that I mess up. And I think one of the things that keeps people from wanting to communicate with plants is they know humans have been messing up, and they're so afraid that they're going to be chastised or shamed or have to feel all the pain that we've caused. But the plants are really forgiving. And so they just recognize that we have many chances to try again, and it's all an experiment. So when I mess up, they let me know, they show me what I can do differently, and they also show me how I can make amends, and encourage me not to, let it spin me out. I have to stay focused. And again, as far as our future, they just seem to be so hopeful. They have a lot to support humans, and they know that we can rise up into who we're meant to be, and that we can learn from our mistakes and create a better world.
Well, that's a very hopeful message. And you mentioned sort of like earthing. That term now was taught by Bernard Jensen, for instance, many, many years ago when I studied with him. But really it has to do with having no shoes on and touching the earth. It sounds like a really fancy thing, but it's really just getting to commune with the earth energy.
Yeah, I think what you just said there, I think that's important. So, so often I think because of our capitalistic society that we're in, we think everything has to be so complex and expensive. And yet here it is, it's like possibly our biggest guides, our biggest helpers in this world. They're growing right out of the cracks for free in cities. And so we can go right to them and learn what it is that we need to do. We don't need any fancy equipment. It might be nice to have a magnifying glass or a pen or paper, but you don't need anything. And it's so, not only does it help us as far as learning and guiding us along the way, but we also feel so much better. They just, when I'm struggling the most, it's when I go to the trees And they just help me come back in. They help shift my perspective, and my body feels better. And of course, there's so much science showing how being in nature is actually necessary for our life and our health, but also how it's so healing.
That's true. And even sometimes going, like we talked about rocks a little bit, in Europe, it's not unusual even for a licensed physician to write a prescription to go into a salt cave, where you're getting not only the salt molecules that you're breathing in, but the energy from those salt rocks. And it's actually becoming more common in the U.S. for physicians to write, go take a walk in nature, as right on a prescription pad. And it makes so much sense.
Right, absolutely. I mean, in my own healing practice, that's almost always what I call home play. And it's almost always one of my recommendations. It's like, you got to go spend time in nature. And it's, again, it's the time that we're struggling the most. That's the time that we have to be there. And I just want to stress, because so often when we talk about go to nature, we think about like we have to go to really wild places like Yosemite or Yellowstone. And really, no matter where you are, nature's around you, even if it's just looking up at the sky. Again, those plants that grow in the cracks, or a tree on a city sidewalk. I'm very fortunate to live in a beautiful sanctuary where I'm surrounded by gorgeous plants and water. But that doesn't have to be, we don't have to go somewhere special. It can be just right outside our doorstep.
Yeah, it's a really good thing to be aware of what's right outside your doorstep, especially like those times, which unfortunately we're hearing about daily everywhere across the country, right? Where everything is washed away in a minute. It just happened actually in Vermont last week at Rosemary Gladstone's sanctuary. Her road is now gone. And that's one of the most intensely gorgeous and respected sanctuaries where there's lots of plant communication going on. And now they're going to have some major trouble. But yet they know which plants are there and what plants they can use for food and medicine while they're getting their supplies through the road being built. So that's a good thing to know about as well.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for writing this book, and, for having it widely available and easy for people to find you at your website at brigittsway.com. And we've been talking today with Jen Frey, author of Communicating with Plants, Heart-Based Practices for Connecting with Plant Spirits. And thank you so much for being our guest today.
My pleasure, Ellen. Thanks for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to Herbally Yours, produced in the studios of 90.3 WHPC, Nassau Community College, Garden City, New York. For further information, email us at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamai at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.